These days, it's generally accepted that for any given game, the PC version will be prettier than the Xbox One X version, which will be prettier than the PS4 Pro version, and so on down, while basically being the same game. And if you want portable, you buy it on the Nintendo Switch, the only currently commercially viable handheld. But in the last century, things were different. Games on different formats might be written by different teams. Consoles and computers had massively different capabilities, and sometimes different requirements by the platform holders. And sometimes, such as with Disney's Aladdin, 3 entirely independent actual games would get released. But it's 2019, and whether by emulation, eBay, or just modern remakes, if you decide to play a game, you have your pick of the lot. So what you need to know is, on what should I play? SimCity. This, more than some of the other games we've covered, might well spark the question, but why would you want to? After all, the series kept evolving until SimCity 4 in 2003, and then arguably de-evolved in 2013 with an online-only version that turned out to be anything but once the cleverer people of the internet got involved. Plus, of course, there's few games more imitated, most notably by the recent City Skylines. And we'll tell you now, if you're here to find a modern, fancy SimCity game, then City Skylines is your game, especially on its native PC. It's on console too, and by all accounts the PS4 and Xbox One versions hold up perfectly well given their control method. Reviews suggest the Switch version suffers from perhaps being a little too ambitious for the system and should be treated with more caution. Skylines is a better modern SimCity than anything EA has produced in 15 years, and indeed only exists because of the opportunity created by the failure of that 2013 reboot on every level. And it's comprehensive. It was actually used by the Transportation Authority of Stockholm to insist on planning some of their infrastructure, and the developers of Bus Simulator 18 used it to build and test their map to make sure it's a convincing city. Which is pretty much my problem with it. I love my simulation strategy type games, but between limited gaming time and limited mental faculty, I find the modern ones are just often too layered and confusing for me. I still prefer the first Tropico, for instance, and I've never quite managed to get into any Railroad Tycoon since the first one. And so it goes with SimCity. There's a simplicity to the first game's general design which makes it understandable for all ages, intelligences, and free timeses. If you've got a spare couple of hours, you probably don't mind giving up a little graphical fidelity for the chance to actually build something useful. But how should you do it? Well, that's why we're here. Was that not obvious? There's quite a few versions to get through, including some quite interesting ones, but we should really start at the beginning. And the beginning for SimCity is not, as you might expect, the PC. The game was first released back in February 1989 for the Macintosh and Amiga, having begun development 4 years earlier on a C64. We've gone with the Amiga version, on the grounds it's a lot easier to emulate or get hold of an Amiga than a compatible 80s Mac these days, and because most Macs at that point were monochrome. You can tell this is early, can't you? The disk boots up to Workbench and you have to double-click the icon to get into the game. And then it drops back into Workbench to start a new city. And there's no music. At all. Anywhere. To be fair, this is a single disc game that was able to run inside the default 512KB memory of an A500. And while it's virtually silent, this is a pretty reasonable way to play the game. The interface is pure Workbench, for some reason having closed buttons in entirely different places in different windows, and the mouse has a tendency to select slightly the wrong square, which can be infuriating when placing roads. The frame rate's also fairly abysmal, for all that matters in a game like this. This is SimCity in its raw, unhewn form. You might notice the lack of an EA logo, and that's because SimCity was self-published initially by Maxis, because publishers didn't understand a game you couldn't win. And as always, there's value in playing the day one version. That's not the remit of this show though, so let's see if we can find a better, later version. That's not going to be the Atari ST version. Being an early ST-FM game, it's basically the Amiga version, but uglier. And speaking of uglier, there was of course a PC version close behind, which is actually a little less pretty than the Amiga one, although has the distinct advantage of running quicker than greased weasel shit on a modern computer. You may, however, want to skip forward a little to the 1993 PC re-release. Known either as SimCity 2.0 or SimCity Classic, it adds some music, and usefully for modern players, strips out the original copy protection. This is probably your easiest bet for playing what you could literally call SimCity Classic. It was free on the SimCity website for many years, and while that's no longer the case, it's difficult to make a moral case against playing it on one of the many sites a quick Google will show you have rehosted it. There was a native Windows 95 version a couple of years later, but that's actually more work these days as you need to hunt down a separate patch to make saving work on modern versions of Windows. 3 distinct versions of a game for the same platform might be a record, but amazingly we're not quite there with the PC. In 2008 there was the One Laptop Per Child project, designed as a way of producing cheap, acceptable computers for children in developing nations. The idea was to hit a price point of $100 a unit, along with the ability for Western consumers to buy one for $200, which would result in them essentially donating a unit to someone who could use it. It wasn't quite the success some hoped, although the fact that some people kept working on the idea is actually what ended up giving the world the retro gaming darling that is the Raspberry Pi. As part of that though, SimCity creator Will Wright secured the rights to release the original source code for SimCity to allow people the chance to have a base for learning to code commercial products on the device. There were 2 conditions. 1, any project resulting from the source code could not be sold for profit, and 2, it couldn't be called SimCity, as that was very much an in-use trademark as far as EA were concerned. Thus, Will returned to the name SimCity had while it was in development, and the source code was released as Micropolis. Armed with this, we can go searching online, and there's a few existent projects where people have made use of the code. There's even one in the Windows Store, but that proved unstable on our test up-to-date Windows 10 machine. Instead we use this, linked in the description. It's basically SimCity again, of course, but with a few important improvements. It's in much higher resolution, and much more of your city is visible, making planning a lot easier. It runs like lightning on a modern PC, and most importantly for us, drawing a road with a mouse will now enforce straight lines, which stops us building stupid Escher-like Doom roads. Given it's open source, we may well have missed a Micropolis or 2 online. If you find an even better one, stick it in the comments for us. But even so, this is probably the best way to play SimCity on a modern PC. It just works in a browser, and of course has the distinct advantage of working on pretty much anything that has a browser. So at this point our Mac friends are allowed back into the room for the first time since 1989, so long as they promise not to make a mess on the good rug. There does exist ports to the obvious 8-bit systems, but they're generally curios and aren't what you need to be playing in 2019. The C64 one, despite being the most powerful of those systems, is missing police and fire stations as well as most of the disasters. The Spectrum one, which is what you're looking at now, is impressively more complete, but has looks only a Sim mother could love. It's also weirdly much harder than any other version we played. If you're just looking for an excuse to show off a BBC-B or Amstrad CPC, they did release versions too. As an engineer, I'm especially impressed by that BBC version, where Peter Scott is going to get a name check just for managing to fit virtually everything in the Amiga version into a space 1/25th of the size. So that's computers. But what about consoles? Well, there's 3 options. One bad, one good, and one that's just interesting. First the bad. There was a version for the Amiga CD-TV. It's basically the Amiga version zoomed in with CD music. There's no reason to play it over the standard Amiga version, and we shan't. Then the good. This is probably the most famous single version of the game, being a near-launch title in most territories for the Super Nintendo. It's not simply a straight port. Nintendo publicised the game on their posters alongside such titles as Super Mario World, Zelda: Link to the Past, and Super R-Type, and as such, they took control. Nintendo both published and developed this version with input from Will, and it's lovely. In fact, I'm going to take a minute and just drink in that intro. So Yooka's tune is one of the most recognisable pieces ever fired through a SNES's audio chips, and that intro is beautiful, while also being a very sneaky but impressive demonstration of some of the SNES's graphical abilities. It's such an iconic piece of gaming that it remains the only game intro I've cosplayed, technically. The intro, theirs, not mine, sets the tone for a port done with a remarkable level of love and care. We're 2 years past the original Amiga version at this point, and maybe it factored into Nintendo's thinking that they didn't want to churn out something that looked like it could be played on what, in Europe at least, was technically their competition. The SNES version has 2 years of ideas in it. There's a tutorial system hosted by Dr. Wright, a character named after and interpretively modelled on Will Wright himself. Dr. W was one of several changes pushed into the game by Nintendo legend Shigeru Miyamoto, and he acts as the tutorial system the game never had. He pops up offering advice and congratulations, as well as incredibly charming warnings about impending doom. It doesn't make the game any easier as such, but it does make it a little more accessible, which is no bad thing for a console launch lineup game. That said, I think this is one of the easier versions of the game. I've been deliberately using the same broad strategy in all these versions for the video, and this version is certainly one of the easier ones to turn a city profitable in. Playing it for nostalgia reasons in 2019, of course, that's no bad thing. In a similar vein, Nintendo also added rewards for attaining the various levels of town, starting with getting your own little mayor house, and scaling right up to a statue of Mario for clearing 500,000 inhabitants. There's 2 extra scenarios, which is always welcome, and the tongue-in-cheek monster attack from the original game has had its generic giant lizard creature replaced with an old friend. It's a little bit of a shame it doesn't support the SNES mouse, due to it not existing yet. Later series spin-off SimAnt would correct this. That's pretty much the only thing holding this back from being far and away the version you want to play if you can. Even so, the joypad controls are good, and the unrivaled atmosphere and joy make this the one I boot up when I want a game. I think overall, this is our winner, although you can't beat Micropolis for sheer convenience these days. The SNES version is perhaps the biggest love letter to a game I've ever seen, and a surprising entry into the list of SNES carts you should own. I was actually a little disappointed they couldn't find room for it on the SNES Mini, especially given EA were happy to let Sega have Road Rash 2 for the Mega Drive equivalent. So if we've already picked our winners, what is that final console version and why is it interesting? Well, it's the NES version. If you owned a NES around the turn of that decade, then you might think you don't remember there being a NES version. And you'd be right, because there wasn't. In fact, it was never released, and unless you watched the right scraps of news footage, you'd have never even known it existed. That is until 2017, when a couple of near-complete development cartridges were unearthed. One found its way to Frank Cifaldi, a well-known video game history preservationist, and was duly documented and dumped. On Christmas Day 2018, the game was made available for download by the Video Game History Foundation, so if you want it, you're just a link in the description away. I guess you could get a cartridge made or run it on a flash cart. For expediency though, we're going the emulator route. It uses some pretty esoteric hardware tricks it seems, because it doesn't run on many of them. If you're a Windows or Linux user, it does appear to run 100% on Mazen, and that's what we've used. In the meantime though, let me give you a flavour. And intro impressions are very good. It's not moving and the music is different, although still rather lovely, but side by side there's really not a lot of difference. And that's actually relatively true in the game itself too. This is leagues beyond the other 8-bit releases graphically, and it even manages to keep music in play unlike the Amiga. It's got a partial implementation of Dr. Wright, selectable from the toolbar to give an instant opinion on your city, and popping up at times of stress or success to offer you the same reward buildings as the SNES version, or warn you about traffic, crime or disasters. It's missing the tutorial element, but like most deficiencies in this version, it's not obvious if that's a machine limitation or just because we're dealing with a game that wasn't quite finished. Equally, it runs slower than the SNES version, and most of the other versions for that matter. A problem that doesn't get better as your city grows, which it seems easier to do in this version than most others. Still, you do have to remember that the NES was 6 years old before the original SimCity came out, and rapidly approaching its 9th birthday by the time we should have seen this version. And on that basis, it's quite the achievement. A genuine gaming curio that was nearly lost to time. I'm very glad I got to play it, and if you ever love SimCity, the pack from VGHF includes that soundtrack in MP3, scans and photos of what little coverage the game got before it vanished, promo art, and for those who felt making Micropolis on a PC was just too easy, an attempted disassembly of the original NES source code. It's 280 megabytes that should be on any retro gamer's hard drive for you to admire, while you play the SNES version instead. This should have been a simple one. Everyone I mentioned the video to immediately just said, PC! But instead we tell a story where the best way to play a real-time strategy game is on a console, and the best way to play it on PC isn't even called SimCity. So there we have it. Play the original in a web browser on virtually anything, play it on a SNES for pure joy, or play it on the NES for a sneak peek at a piece of gaming history we very nearly never got to see. Thank you, and remember, vote Mayor Dudley for 4 more years.